Elizabeth Garner is the state demographer, and she joined the Colorado Department of Local Affairs in 2004. She has over 20 years of experience analyzing population and economic trends in the state. The State Demography Office produces population and economic estimates and forecasts for use by state agencies and local government and agencies. Current areas of research including aging in Colorado, characteristics of migration and poverty. Elizabeth is an economist and received her BA in business at the University of San Diego, her master's in agriculture and resource economics at Colorado State University, and she is a Denver native. So that's the official stuff. I've had the privilege to meet Elizabeth over the last couple months. Our company's been working with her. We had a wonderful dinner last night. And by the way, I'd like to just do a shout out to La Forchetta. It's a little local Italian bistro here in town. If you're looking for a great restaurant, I'd highly recommend La Forchetta. Here's the fun part about Elizabeth, though. So when I said, why a demographer, how do you even get into that? She said, well, I've really had interest to become an economic developer. But she's very keen on numbers. So she likes numbers, sees them in her sleep, she dreams about them, and she likes to see trends. And so that love of numbers is what got her into being a demographer. When we talked about why she loves Colorado, again, she's a Colorado native, but she says she loves the unique beauty of every region. Everywhere she goes, she sees the beauty within that. She shared that when she gets home from doing a visit of a local city or local town, that her husband's concerned because she always wants to move to that town. So, but Denver's home, where she's from. It's going to be hard to leave. Elizabeth met her husband while in the Peace Corps. And from there, that expanded into having two beautiful children. Her son lives in Indiana. Her daughter lives in Columbia. So with that, please join me with a warm welcome, Miss Elizabeth Garner.
All right, so I didn't really think he would say everything that we talked about last night, especially that I dream about numbers. Now you guys are going to be like, oh, God, what is she going to really talk about? Thanks so much. I know that there's a timer, and I'm going to try and make it go. Is there a button that says go? Yes. No. Damn. Well, we'll just watch my watch. All right. So thanks so much for having me here this morning. I'm excited to be here. I love this conference. And I love all of you guys and the work that you guys do throughout the state. And within the context today, two things that if you looked at the agenda, one is that future of the past, and I love that, and I'm going to get into that in a second. And the other one is really thinking about things in terms of population and population-centric and people-centric. And so when I saw that, when I was reading the agenda material, I was like, yes, finally people care about people. And as the state demographer, that's, that music to my ears. And the big piece is that everything is connected. When we're looking throughout the state and we're looking at the connections, yeah, you're in economic development, and we were talking this morning, labor force and economic development should be doing more together. And I'm like, yes, absolutely, because everything's connected. And if we think about it in terms of population, on one end, we've got population driving economic development, right? Driving your spending, drives the economy. But then on the other end, population is your labor force. And so making sure that whether you're in economic development, whether you're in workforce, whether you're in housing, whether you're in food systems, whether you're in supply chain, which are all topics today, all of these pieces are connected to one another, and it's important to understand how all of the different pieces are changing. So when we think about the future of the past, again, it totally hit the nail on the head, because when we think about who we are today So much of it is actually driven by what we did 20 and 30 years ago. How many babies did we have? What kind of housing and infrastructure did we develop years ago to be thinking about who we are today, let alone where we think we might be going into the future? So a couple of the big things that we need to take into account when we're looking at trends is the fact that we are slowing down. And what does that mean 20 years from now? We're seeing this slowdown primarily because we're seeing fewer births and more deaths, and not just COVID deaths. It's just that we're getting older and more of us in age groups with higher death rates. And then it's really funny. I'm short, so I can't see this. I can't see my cheat screen. I know. I feel taller. I just am not. We're also seeing that mobility and migration is slowing down. So that's going to be another big impact. And our concentration of growth is also in different areas. We're seeing jobs as well as people concentrating in the Front Range. You're going to come up here and help the short person out. Yes, just a little bit further that direction, and then I might be able to see. I know. I felt like 5'4" was tall, but it's not at all. Perfect, thank you. We're also, and I love to say this, we're also aging, right? How many of you woke up a day older? All right, we're all doing that, and I mean, that is much better than the alternative. And that has huge implications. Our age distribution is probably one of the most important things that we look at. The last thing is that we really are growing more racially and ethnically diverse. And that's going to have long-run implications as well in terms of who our future consumers are, as well as who is our future labor force. So just to kind of prove these points, within the United States, what we've seen is actually a big slowdown. Over this last decade, between 2010 and 2020, the US, yes, increased by 22 million people, a 7% growth rate, but it was also the second slowest growth rate on record for a decade, compared to the first one was the Great Depression in the 1930s. So the US is slowing down. This last year, between 2020 and 2021, the US grew by its slowest growth rate ever, by a 0.1. 17 states lost population. Now, I know all of you are saying in the back of your head, oh, but Elizabeth, it was a weird year. Yes, hands down, weird year, but it still matters, the fact that it was it was the slowest growth rate ever. Colorado, in the same time frame, over the decade, increased by 744,000, and some of you are thinking, oh, so many people. I'm like, nah, it's not really. Big picture, it was an average decade between 2010 and 2020. Not our fastest, not our slowest, right? Kind of average. But this last year, between 2020 and 2021, our growth rate slowed, as well as our total absolute amount to 30,000. And not only did we slow in numbers, we also slowed relative to other places in the country, other states. So there is something fundamentally changing. And we need to think about, what does that mean for Colorado in the future? So if we look at the growth of Colorado and the United States, the US is in the red line, Colorado is the blue bars. This shows our long-run growth trends starting in 1990 going to 2050. We can see both the US as well as Colorado slowing down in that growth rate. So what I want you to be thinking about today and tomorrow and into your future is, what does this slowing growth rate mean to the work that you do? If we know that most likely this decade is going to be growing slower than last decade, what does that mean? Now, some of you might be, screaming for joy inside, right? You're like, ooh, I don't like cars, I don't like people in the houses, I don't like people on the ski slope. fine, you have your lens, right? And I'll be honest with you, I'm growth agnostic. Whether you're fast growing, slow growing, what I want you to think about is how does that impact the work that you do? It's like the so what. So if we look at Colorado's population change over the decade, red, orange, yellow positive, all of the shades of blue declines. We can see the concentrated growth along the I-25 corridor. 95% of the total change in the state occurred in the Front Range, contrary to historical trends, which is closer to 80%. So yes, something fundamentally changed. Most of that actually has to do with you guys. Has to do with economic development and what kinds of industries we grew and where they were located. Most of it along the I-25 corridor. 95% of the job growth occurred in the Front Range, like total population change. When we look at the components of total population change, this is why, the future of the past is so important. These bars represent total population change, starts in 1970. We can see 1 year in the 100,000s in 1970. We see about 7 years of growth over 100,000 in the 90s into the early 2000s. The last time we increased by over 100,000 was in 2001, over 20 years ago. And this is an important narrative for you guys to take home, because when you hear, especially media, any media here? Of course not, they're scared. No. Do you see anything exponential recently, if you remember your math classes? No, not in terms of our growth. We see nice, flat, and then declining in terms of growth. Now, if you look at the 90s, yes, you could say that was probably close to exponential in terms of growth. But really, we have not grown by over 100,000 since 2001. We had some great years in the 2000s where we stayed relatively flat in terms of really between 60 and 80,000, right around 70,000 for about 12 years straight. Then we had a little bit blip in 2015, and then we've been declining ever since. Not declining in our growth. Slowing down in that growth ever since. The blue bars is natural increase, burst minus deaths. The red bar, part of the bar, is net migration, the ins minus the outs. You can see that slow down, especially in the natural increase. I don't think we'll ever have as high a level of natural increase as we had in 2007. Out forever into the future, unless something really, really weird happens. I mean, it'd have to be really weird. If we look at the net migration, the ins minus the out, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. And I want you to be thinking about this, because you're going to be thinking, how does this decade look different that we're currently in than our past, our last decade? So again, we've seen a lot of counties without migration, a lot along the Eastern Plains, Southeast especially, a little bit into the San Luis Valley, and then into the Northwest. How does this decade change from what we saw historically? If we look at natural increase, the burst minus deaths, again, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. We can also see there were definitely counties last decade that were experiencing natural decline, meaning more deaths than births. If you have more deaths than births as well as net out migration, what does that mean? How can you change that, if you want to, into this next decade? So I mentioned the fact that we've seen this decline in births, this slowdown in births. U.S. is down about 525,000 fewer births per year. Colorado's down about 8,000 fewer births per year than our peak birth in 2007. That makes our peak person 15. After that, an absolute slowdown. And as I like to say, and I'm sure people have heard it before from me, once you don't have a person, it's really hard to create a new one fast. Right? And especially like if you think of an ideal maybe 25-year-old, and that's giving them a lot of credit, it's going to take you a good 25 years to come up with a new one. Yes, people have thought about, can I get them in from other states or other countries? But I'm telling you, at the point, the U.S. experienced an absolute decline in the under 18 population over the last decade of 1 million. There are 1 million fewer under 18 in the United States now than there was a decade ago. Red, orange, yellow, or red, orange, peach are the states that experienced an increase in the under 18. All of the shades of blue experienced an absolute decline. Yes, you're looking at California. Yes, you're looking at Illinois, the Northeast, and you should be, because these are some of the biggest donor states to your labor force, to our labor force. Not only our labor force, but our higher ed system. You talk to higher ed, and really, California and Illinois are the two largest donors to our higher ed system for paying out-of-state tuition. And as Russ mentioned, this is critical because these states know what it's like to compete for youngins. We've kind of always taken it for granted. Oh, we can get cool people because we're cool, right? But now we're kind of cool and expensive. How do you continue to attract cool people when there's an absolute decline and we're more expensive? And we haven't been really competing for people. A lot of people are like, yeah, I don't like people. We have to think about people and what that's going to take to attract and retain folks to Colorado. Again, if you want them. And I'm going to try and let you know that I think that people aren't that bad. That there is a rationale for trying to attract and retain. If we look then at Colorado over the last decade, red, orange, yellow, positive, or it's kind of, oh yeah, no, it looks much better up there. Positive growth in that under 18 population, all of the shades of blue, absolute decline in the under 18 population over this last decade. And it doesn't matter where you were, whether you were Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, Western Slope, Denver Metro. There were counties with an absolute decline. Our under 18 increased by 38,000 over the last decade. Our total growth was 744,000. 5% of our total growth was in the under 18. The previous decade, our under 18 increased by about 125,000. Now, I know a lot of you were thinking about today and tomorrow. I want you to go a little bit further into the future because that's the planning you need to do now. We're probably okay this decade for kiddos. And you're thinking to yourself, really, it's kind of tight right now. I'm like, just wait. Just wait. Our peak person is 15. 7 more years, they may be entering into the labor force and then not be there. Things to be thinking about on how we move forward. If we look at this last year between 2020 and 2021, what was the growth like in the United States as a whole? Now I'm going to totally screw up the colors for you. We're not following the same ones that I set up. Census Bureau, I swear. But if we look at this, the red, orange, yellow, were actually states that experienced an absolute decline in population over the year. 17 states declined in population. 3 of those states, California, Illinois, New York, declined by over 100,000 over the last year. Important to see these pictures, and the purples are those that grew. Where do we see growth in the United States? Where are we not seeing it? Because you're going to be needing to think about, again, attract and retain. And I want to really, really emphasize that retention component of how do we keep people as well. Over this last year, like I had mentioned, it was a weird year, right? Between 2020 and 2021, and you're like, Elizabeth, we're in 22. I know, just not done with the data yet. We grew by 30,000 Typically, we end up growing in that 70,000 range, so less than half of what our average was this last decade. Red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. And you're looking at Denver, Boulder, Jefferson, all declines in absolute population this last year. Yes, it was a weird year. And if you're looking at the numbers, they're even weirder. We had 62,000 births, 46,000 deaths, 15,000 in net migration. If you think about it, we had an absolute decline of the adult population over this last year, right? Because you had 46,000 deaths, most of those are adults, 15,000 in net migration, those coming in. That gives us an absolute decline in the adult population this last year. Something to be thinking about. If we look at the natural increase, the births minus deaths, all of the shades of blue and that light blue that looks like white, absolute decline. These are all of the counties that experienced an absolute natural decline in the population because the births were smaller than the deaths. Again, you can see the concentrated growth along the I-25 corridor. If we look at net migration, same idea, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue, net out migration. And this is really where you can kind of see the impacts from COVID, right? You say net out from Denver, Arapahoe, Adams, so this Denver metro-centric, net out migration, but you also see net out migration from Eagle, Summit, Pitkin, so some of the resort areas as well. So kind of interesting to see that dynamic of out migration from where you probably thought you would see it. But again, what is that long run implication? So I've talked about the births and deaths a lot. I've talked a little bit about the net migration. And it's so important to think about net migration. Who do we typically attract to the state? And if we look at these charts, the top one, top left, is Colorado as a whole. This is the age distribution of our migrants. Who do we typically attract? Those young adults, 22 to 37. What did I just mention that we're going to start to see a slowdown in? Not this decade necessarily, but starting kind of in 2027. Those young adults. So we need to be thinking, if our bread and butter, I didn't say it, I heard you giggle. It's Thursday, not Friday. Not that you can swear on Fridays, but it's more likely. Especially from me. But important to be thinking about that component. If we then look at the top right, that's Pueblo, understanding where we are today, and the dynamic in their net migration by age. You can see kind of a drive to some of the young adults that would be at the university, but then you see a net out in that 20-something. But then look at all of the other age groups for Pueblo. They attract people in. I love doing Summit County is that bottom left. They get those youngins and then they lose them. And they take their kiddos with them, and it makes sense, right? It's really hard to afford and live in Summit County. And you can see that dynamic take place in the net migration by age. I threw Garfield County in here as well, really to show that they lose some of those kiddos right around that college age, but then they really bring them in that 30-something. These we've got available on our website, and you can get them for whatever community you are working in. But the biggest piece behind it is, why do people move? Why do people come to areas? And this is so critical, especially kind of for the housing conversation that's going to be coming up later. Typically, when there is job growth, which is the blue bars, we get more net migration, which is the red line. And it makes sense. You can see when we had a lot of job growth going on in the 90s, we ended up having a lot of net migration. When we had some recessions, we see slower job growth and slower net migration. I will tell you, Front Range, hands, people from, This confuses you, right? Because people are like, yeah, we're going to do job growth. And I'm like, yeah, but that's going to create more people. And you haven't been fans of people. And maybe not you specifically, but maybe other people in your community. But the point is, a job is a person, and the housing units is where that job sleeps at night. And guess what? It's going to get more dramatic because there's a lot of older people in your communities. And guess what they're going to do? They're going to retire. But guess what? They're super fans of Colorado. And they're not going to leave. And that's going to impact this jobs housing mix as well. So when we migrate people to Colorado, where do they usually come from? I mentioned that California and Illinois and New York component, and that's what you can see, red, orange, yellow, positive. All of the shades are blue are areas where Colorado actually loses people to. You can see that big sucking sound going into that northwest part of the country. Leaving Colorado, trying to get more rural, probably, I don't know. But you can see that dynamic taking place. So yes, we attract people from the coasts and Illinois, and then, yes, still Texas. And it's all right. A lot of them I have met, and they're really nice. And they're good workers, and they spend money, so it's not bad at all. But I will tell you, so this is kind of old data. You're thinking to yourself, Elizabeth, this is kind of old, it's kind of boring. Agreed. And this is even different than what we typically use. We use typically the American Community Survey, and they don't have current data on their website. So this is the most current out there. This is from the IRS records. And you might be, again, thinking to yourself, pretty old. So there is other stuff that we look at to follow net migration, and one of them is actually unemployment rates. And on this line, what we end up seeing, the red line is net migration, starts over time, starts in like 76. The blue line is interesting. It's our relative rank in unemployment compared to other states. So when you see the blue line go really high, that actually means that we've got some of the lowest unemployment in the country. And when you see that blue line go high, and that means low unemployment, you also see the red line go up, which is net migration. So this is a great indicator thinking about, because that's always what people ask me. They're like, so how many people are coming, and are we attractive or not? We saw that we were really plummeting recently, basically since about 2017, really slowing down in our net migration. We also saw during that same time, our relative rank in unemployment also started changing to where we weren't the highest or one of the lowest unemployments. We started changing. We started seeing higher and higher unemployment rates. And relative to other states, we also then saw net migration start to slow down. At the bottom, the last months, what we've started to see is a turnaround, which may indicate that we are now a little bit more competitive in terms of bringing in net migration. But at the same time, what we've seen in the United States is the fact that mobility is slowing down. So that assumption in your head that people are going to continue to move here needs to change. So that future of our past impressions is going to be different. The blue line ends up showing the total state-to-state movement, total state-to-state movement in the country. This chart starts in the 1940s, okay? So we kind of got into this peak movement in the 90s into the early 2000s, and even in total absolute numbers, even though the United States is bigger, we've started to see this slowdown in mobility. The red line is mobility rate, the number of state-to-state movements relative to the total population. really at its peaks in the 50s, slowing down. So again, think to yourself, how does this matter in terms of your assumptions and what you're planning for this next decade? So what are we thinking in terms of the economy? We had a great speaker yesterday. Nick was super talking about what's going on in the United States. Where does Colorado fit into this picture? Big point is, yay, we've recovered total jobs from what we lost during COVID. We're at about 114%. So Colorado's the blue line, the US is the red line. US is at about 100%, 101%, recovered from those total jobs lost during COVID. But if we look across the state, we get this pattern that's a little bit different. Red, orange, yellow, positive. All of the shades of blue are still counties that haven't recovered all of those jobs. And I will tell you, and I'll be honest, this is a little old in terms of data. It's really as of December of 2021. It doesn't include all of the job growth in 22 because we do more of our work on an annual basis rather than the monthly or quarterly. But even looking at the quarterly data, it only adds one more county in. Instead of it being 27 counties, or 28 counties not recovered, it's down to 27 counties not fully recovered. And the placement is weird, right? You get some in the metro that have recovered, some not. Some in the Eastern Plains that have and have not. Some in the Western Slope that have and have not. But I want you to also be thinking about, how does this relate to housing and availability of housing for that labor force? On top of all of this, we've got this weirdness called telecommuting or telework. And I know a lot of you are thinking to yourself, you know, it's kind of groovy. I don't have to go into the office as often, right? And a lot, even before COVID, we're looking at teleworking as an economic development strategy. What this line shows is just the share of the population or the share of the workers teleworking due to COVID. So this is just primarily COVID. We were at a high of about 35%, slowing down to about 7%. Teleworking primarily just because of COVID. Let's pray that it's almost over or is over. So it's interesting to see, yes, it's slowed down. And we know yesterday, I loved Nick's slides from yesterday talking about the impact of teleworking on different industries, those unemployment rates, and those wage differentials. That was pretty cool for a person that likes data and looking at dots on the board, right? I was all into it. I don't know if everybody else was. If we look by industry, it's very different how many people can telecommute. I know in our office in Department of Local Affairs, everybody was like, yeah, no, everybody teleworks. And I'm like, in this office. But I am sure your King Soopers worker doesn't. Your police chief, hopefully not. Your teachers. Most of our labor force does not telecommute. Most of our labor force has to work in an office or be with people. And so it's interesting to see what relative share do we have in those pieces. And the reason I bring this up is that we used to potentially be excited, right, about teleworking, especially in maybe rural parts of Colorado where you might be able to attract that person to, let's say, Sterling, to fill a job. They can bring their partner with them, and that person could then potentially telework. You wouldn't need to necessarily find 2 jobs for somebody to come into your area. What happens now if both of those people telecommute and they're not even available for your labor force? And thinking about what is your wage rate now compared to Denver's wage rate? If the job is in Denver, but I'm living in Sterling, are they making off better than by both working in Sterling? So thinking about, is teleworking a complement or is it competition? We know this is showing 2 different areas in terms of people teleworking on the left-hand side and people absolute remote, meaning they don't have to show up in the office at all. And we can see that it's definitely increased from 14% to about 21% in terms of the people teleworking, and doubled really from about 5% to 11% those that are working absolutely remote. But think within your own communities, is this a benefit or is it a drawback, and how do I leverage and manage it? And how do I take account in my housing? So not only was I worried about housing my population, my labor force in Summit County, but now I've got people living there that don't even work there. Now, maybe that's always been an issue in Summit County, but what happens if it's the same thing in Logan County? Think about this additional competition for other resources like housing, like daycare, like healthcare. I won't go into a lot of this, but it's very interesting to see, and Nick kind of talked about this yesterday, that Colorado really does rank fairly high in that share of the population or share of the workers that are telecommuting. The darker color, kind of purple-red, are the higher levels of telecommuting relative to other positions. And we can see Denver is about ranked 8th in the country in terms of the share of its population teleworking, or share of its workers. So let's then talk about housing and how this impacts housing in Colorado. So we've got this supply-demand issue, and thank goodness there's a housing section today. I'm going to be very interested to hear of them talk about what solutions do we have in place. I was a little disheartened yesterday with Nick and talking about how the increase in interest rates have definitely slowed down the production of housing right when we need more housing. And he says, oh yeah, but hopefully we'll do it quickly. And I'm like, when have we ever done anything quickly? Point is, we still have a mismatch between demand for housing and supply of housing. The orange bars are each year annual housing growth. The black line is household formation, those that come together and live in a house. We don't do a really good job of pairing those two pieces up. And over the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, we built about 126,000 fewer housing units than we did the previous decade. Yet we grew by more people. Just a couple more, just about 25,000 more. But that certainly was going to put a bummer into our housing supply, because we kept growing during these last decade, this last 12 years, we kept a pretty solid growth. We've started to see this slowdown in population growth in the red line, and finally started to pick up total housing units. And if we look at just building permits, which doesn't guarantee a housing unit, we can see where we are right now. 2021, we did a lot of permits. I don't think we've actually got the industry to fulfill all of those units coming in terms of permits. But we should see somewhere between 50 and 60,000 units coming online. So much better, hopefully, if we can get them built, in terms of that supply of housing coming on. And hopefully it's not too little too late. Will we end up finally getting all of these housing units online, but our population plummets? Not plummets, slows down a lot in terms of that growth. Another way to think about this is just this relative share of housing units to households. Instead of thinking new versus old, what about just total share? This starts in 1980 at the very top, looks at that share of total housing units to households, about 12% over in 1980. And again, 12%, think about it as vacant, but not vacant like we think of vacant. Vacant meaning not a primary occupied. And I hope we talk a little bit more about primary occupancy later on today, and that importance in your own communities. We know during the 80s was a total bummer. We had out-migration, we had the savings and loan bust, we had the oil and gas bust. You can see then that ratio of housing to units to households increase to where vacancy got up to about 16%. In the 90s, it slows down to about 10%. During the Great Recession, it gets back up to about 15%. Then it gets to its lowest level ever in 2016 of about 9%. And we know that that is really when we started to see prices go off the chart in terms of escalation. We now start to see ourselves building our way out. Do I know the right ratio? And we get this question all the time. So what is that perfect supply level, or what is that gap? And if anybody comes out to you and says, we know exactly how many housing units are missing, they're making it up because there's not good enough data out there. We know a range of what's missing, but every community is going to be different. And I would ask the question, not just total housing units, but primary occupied. Primary occupied, meaning that is where they're living most of their life, in that housing unit. Because what we're seeing is a lot of units that aren't primarily occupied. And that is really hard for communities, to the point where it is really pushed up Colorado's median home price. We've got the 4th highest median home value, yet our income is only about 12th. Does that make it hard for most of us to live here? Absolutely. So I'm not going to go into the big differences between the supply and demand for housing. Hopefully we're going to hit a lot of those today in the conversations. But the point is that there is this big mismatch between supply and demand for housing, and it's not over yet. I alluded to it a little bit ago, the fact that we've got a lot of older adults. Our fastest growing age group, 65 plus. What do they tend to do? Leave the labor force. Nick was talking about it yesterday. A huge exodus of people older leaving the labor force over this last decade. And guess what? We're forecasting that same level this decade. And they're going to be like me. God willing, I'm going to age to 65 plus. I know people are like, God, you really wish that? And I'm like, absolutely. Because again, the alternative isn't good. I'm going to age out, retire, if Paris still's with us. I'm going to stay in my house. Next state demographer's not living there. And there's about 500,000 of us that are going to do that over this decade. So again, if you think housing is tight now, just wait. So let's talk about that aging. How many people think about age in your own communities? And you're actively looking at your age distribution. 1, she wins. 2, yeah, 3. Yay. I'm glad somebody's looking at it. Because what does it impact? It totally impacts everything. Your preferences, what you buy, certainly what you do at 20, 40, 60, 80 is totally different. Where you spend those dollars drives the economy. I've got some 20-somethings. I'm really hoping they change their preferences. We've got a lot of people aging into the 65 plus. What do? Spend a lot more on services rather than goods. How does that impact your community? Impacts your housing, how they participate in the labor force, how much money they make. Again, just to give you a different idea of what we've got in the state, Colorado is that top left age distribution. We can see the peak person right about 29. We can see that slowdown in the youngins. There are fewer 0-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds. So we know that this impact is going to come into place. Then we've got Morgan County. Anybody Morgan? They've got a nice age distribution. I know Russ was talking about, yeah, she dreams of numbers at night. I do. I dream of your age distributions. Morgan's, look at theirs. They've got kiddos. Important to see that that is a potential labor force. Then we've got Summit County. Don't you love Summit is the bottom left? Their age distribution. Again, it totally mirrors what we saw in terms of that migration pattern. They've got a lot of 30-somethings. And then we've got Pueblo on the bottom right. Look at that slowdown in their kiddos. They experienced natural decline this last year, more deaths than births. And you can see that. Look at the purple and kind of a turquoise blue on the far right, higher than the kiddos. This is available for every county. So you can look at your age distribution and understand, do you have a labor force? Should you be investing in Toys R Us or not? How many of you are focusing on the 65 plus in your own economic outlook? No one? One. She wins. 65 plus is the fastest growing age group in the state for another couple of decades. If we look at what the forecast is just this decade, blue is 2020, orange is 2030, very little growth in the under 24. How many of you are focused on the under 24? You're not going to raise your hand, are you? Interesting to see very little, if not flat, growth in those youngins. In that working age, prime working age population of the 25 to 44-year-olds, forecast growth there if we can migrate them here. Very little growth in the 45 to 64, but if you look at the 65 plus, of about the 700,000 that were forecast to grow this next decade, about 40% of it is in that 65 plus. And I know a lot of you are like, but wait, I looked at that net migration and it didn't look like anybody's moving here that's 65 plus. I'm like, no, you are correct. Look in a mirror. It is you, it is us aging into that 65 plus population. So I really want you to think about this in terms of the labor force, in terms of demand and economic development, of how does this impact your community. We know that we're going to experience the slowest growth in those aging into the working age population and the fastest growth in those aging out of the working age population. This is going to be the first time in our real history where we've got this slowdown in the working age population and the fastest growth in the retirement age population. And what does that mean to the work that you do? Again, if we look at this map, it's hard to see. If we, the whitish color is actually blue. All of these counties experiencing an absolute decline in the working age population. Red, orange, peach is positive. All of the shades of white is blue. Absolute decline in the working age population. So when you're looking at your economic development strategies, it not only is it, can we create jobs for the people that live here, you may want to find out if they plan on working. Or do you also need to try and attract a person to those communities as well? So lots of implications from age and aging, but I really want you to be thinking about consumer demand, the types of products and services they want. In absolute numbers across the board, it is going to be your fastest growing age group. And then also think about it in terms of your labor force. And thinking about, we've got this conundrum that we heard about yesterday, you guys are all faced with it. How do we improve this labor force? And we've got a segment after mine really going into that to be thinking about the labor force. But we need to be thinking about it in terms of numbers as well. And the fact is, we've got to eke out just a little bit more from our current population because the ability to attract them is probably diminishing. That means we need to look at potentially bringing in those under 24 more to the labor force. I know, I've got some. They're not easy, but they will eventually turn 30. The future of our past. Bring them in, take care of them, make sure that they've got housing and a good mentor. Keep those older folks in the population in the labor force. There might be something valuable. I think I have a little bit of value. Help train them, bring them along, maybe give them part-time work if they don't want to work full-time. Hint to the governor, if I just didn't have to work full-time, no. Also look at encouraging others that aren't in the labor force to get into the labor force at higher levels, whether it's people that have disabilities, people that were formerly incarcerated. I was hearing a fun story yesterday about a program to train inmates. But think about strategies like that to encourage those that aren't in the labor force to get in there and those that are in there to stay longer. So the last thing I'm going to briefly talk about is population change by race and ethnicity. Fact is, we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, but we are not a diverse state. When site selectors come and they look at Colorado, they're like, not very diverse. But we're getting there. Little by little, it's going to take birthdays by birthdays. If we look at that 18 plus, over the last decade, and the increase in that population was about 700,000. 40% of that growth was in our white non-Hispanic. 60% was in our people of color. If we look at our under 18 population, the bottom part of the chart, we had an absolute decline in our white non-Hispanic population. Our only growth was in our people of color. So our youngins are much more diverse than our older population. And if we look at this chart, our youngins really close to 45% people of color compared to those that are leaving the labor force, only about 16% people of color. So big difference there as well. We also know that unemployment rates are different by race and ethnicity. Focus on the green, which is current time, we can see that our white non-Hispanic and our Hispanic population, we've seen this drop in unemployment rates, but still incredibly high for our black population. Again, these are areas that we can focus on to bring more people into the labor force, train, get working. We also know that educational attainment changes by race and ethnicity. We've seen increases by all race ethnic groups in educational attainment, but still a huge disparity. So having and making sure that the economic developers are working with K-12 and higher ed to make sure that we're doing a better job of educating all of our kiddos, because what you should be taking away from all of this is the fact is your labor force is going to be tight. What you're seeing today is nothing compared to where we're moving into the future. Births are down, and there is nothing that you can change about that. Once they didn't happen, they don't happen, right? I mean, we can start having them, but it's going to take 25 years to get a good one. We have to manage that. We've seen mobility slowing down. We've seen aging. All of these pieces are going to put this downward pressure on our labor force. Plus, we've got these other things like gig employment and teleworking and housing constraints that are all affecting your labor force. So I think the point of this session, plus what we're going to be seeing today and tomorrow, is how can we reimagine what we're doing, taking all of this into account, being intentional and strategic in that economic development growth, knowing that it's a person that needs a housing unit, knowing that there are people that are anti-people. How do you talk to your entire community about the value of people? How do you think about being additive rather than poaching? Stealing a worker from another firm doesn't count. And we do it all the time. How do we bring more people into the labor force, not just steal from another community or another county? Think about the employees. Think about people. People should be the center of everyone's mind. And this is really the first time in over 60 years that we've really had to focus on it because of the baby boomers, which are still the largest generation ever, are aging out of the labor force. And this is a big hit to us and what we're looking at and what we need. Our forecast is continued growth. So I'm not saying we're going to decline in population for the state as a whole. Red, orange, yellow, positive, shades of blue, flat to declines, but there are areas that are forecast to decline. We are forecasting an increase of about 1.7 million people between 2020 and 2050. This is much slower than we've seen. We used to have a forecast of up of 9 million by 2050. We're now at 7.4 million, so we've seen it slow down. So with that, I want to thank you guys and hope that you have an incredible conference. Thank you, EDCC, for having me. And hopefully this has given you some food for thought. And think about, how does your county fit into what we're seeing? Think about these uncertainties. We heard a lot yesterday about water, which is probably one of the most important uncertainties that we think about. That was a fantastic presentation by James. But thank you guys so much, and we'll turn it